An Australian film is having two special screenings at the Nova Cinema on September 8th and 10th, a film called My Friend the Moon. And it's my great pleasure to be speaking to the writer-director of My Friend the Moon, Mark La Rosa. Mark, welcome to Movie Metropolis.
Hi, Peter. Good to be here.
Tell me about the film. It's such an intriguing film about a brother and sister who go on to make a documentary in the southwest of Victoria. Tell me about the concept behind it and how it all came about.
Well, a number of years ago, I think 2015, I completed a short film. That film called Regolith, that played at the Melbourne Film Festival, um, was about a brother and sister going on a road trip. Um, the entire film was shot on 16mm footage, and it was as though the brother was recording this road trip on his own Bolex camera. And initially, it's just like a travelogue. He's filming the places they visit in Central Australia. But gradually, and it's only 10 minutes long, but gradually the attention turns to the sister. Now, he's narrating the film, and so we hear him, but we don't see him, and we see her, but she doesn't speak. So it becomes about her and her history with mental illness. As I was making that film, I thought, there might be a story here that I could flesh out into a drama, into a feature-length drama, because it's very contained. Just the two characters, very minimal props, and just the natural landscape. So it grew out of that, and I developed more of a backstory that involved both of them. Into the story, and I chose a different part of Melbourne, the southwest. Different part of Victoria, the southwest of Victoria, which is a volcanic region. So that's the basis of it. Yeah.
Oh, how very interesting. And I read that you received a grant to be able to make the film.
Yes, that's interesting too. Now, I began writing this film in 2018, and into 2019, and we filmed most of it in 2020 in March over 3 weeks. Now, if you remember back then, COVID was spreading, and I think it was the 16th of March on a Thursday, we decided to postpone the rest of the shoot, which wasn't easy, but it was spreading, and we thought we might be part of the problem here as we gather to make this film. We were kind of isolated away from other people, but amongst ourselves, who knows? So we thought, okay, we'll see what happens, and we'll come back together and make it again. I didn't know there would be such long lockdowns, but the day after the shoot, I just began editing the film. So for those months, and then there were very long lockdowns in Victoria, and I was beginning to wonder whether I'd ever finish this film. But then back in November, things started to open up again, and we resumed at the end of November for the final week of the shoot. Then I began editing the film again and grading it, and began recording sounds, Foley and Atmos and all that. And about that time, I think the following year in 22, so 21 was all editing, grading, and 22, I applied for this grant from the City of Melbourne, Arts Grant, which stipulated that what you make has to have a public outcome within the City of Melbourne boundary, which is not just the CBD, but surrounding suburbs as well. So I thought, okay, I could take this opportunity to get funding for a sound mix, because that's one thing that I can't do, or at least I can't do surround sound. So I asked for money for that and to screen it at a cinema within this boundary, and I chose the Nova Cinema, and also some money to make digital cinema package so that it can be shown in a cinema. And I was lucky enough to receive that. So when I received that news, I thought, okay, the sound mix is only going to be as good as the sound that I deliver. So I sort of stepped up and tried to, record the best sounds I possibly could, including the Foley. And I think it worked out well. I mean, the 2 weeks that I was at Music and Effects in South Yarra were really special, were really great, and lifted the film. So it was a good outcome. But my obligations are not complete with the City of Melbourne because I need to put on the screening. So that's what's happening early next month. Yeah.
Yes, on September 8th and 10th at the Nova. And I'm interested to see that they're free screenings.
They are, that's right. It's meant to be accessible to all, so I've made them free. Yeah.
Okay. Now, why did you call the film My Friend the Moon?
Well, Elsa, the sister, traveling along with her brother Martin, she, you figure out pretty quickly she doesn't want to be there. She has her own mental health issues, and their trip into Southwest Victoria lasts 3 days, 2 nights. So we see them at night in their separate tents, and he sleeps fairly well, but she doesn't. She's tossing and turning. And we see at the beginning of the film, also she's had trouble sleeping. So when you suffer from insomnia and you get up out of bed, often the moon is there. So the moon becomes your friend.
Hmm. Okay, no, that sounds very reasonable. I've always intrigued as to how films get their titles. Now, this exploration of the brother and sister is so interesting, and that's set alongside the Western District volcanic regions of Victoria. Juggling the two of those aspects, the sort of the fictional story and the documentary that they're making about that region, I found that so intriguing. How easy was it to juggle those two aspects?
Well, it was easy to do because all the documentary that we see snippets of it.
Mm.
That was all shot later. So during the main shoot, it was just with the actors. That acts as a sort of analogy for their story in that we learn their background with their father, who was himself an amateur filmmaker, and Elsa's experience with him in particular were not pleasant ones. She was his, as she describes it anyway, we have to trust what she says about him. She was his camera assistant, being the older child. And he was a stern man, and yeah, it evokes bad memories for her. We don't know everything that went on. But his presence haunts the film. I mean, he's passed away, but his presence sort of haunts the film. So even with Martin, we don't know what drives him to make these documentaries, or actually he's never really completed any of them, which is interesting. But we're not sure what drives him. But when they do get together in the car, and they've been on these trips before, inevitably the discussion turns back to the father. So it's on his mind as well. So this father figure, who's like the third character, has, I guess, impacted on them as adults now, and they're in middle age. So it's that time where you look back, and he's impacted them perhaps in negative ways, according to what each of them says, especially Elsa. So, in other words, you could say that the past haunts the present and forms the present. And that's supported, that idea is supported when we see the documentary or these snippets from the documentary and the geological formations that we see there, the volcanoes, the lava tunnels, the lava caves, the tumuli, and there's an explanation of how they came to be. So again, you can read the past in the present in these formations. So that's the analogy that's working. And this documentary is sort of braided through the story of these two characters.
Mm. Again, very interesting. I really enjoyed the story and the way it developed. I'd love to see that 16mm camera and the argument that comes into the film about analog versus digital. I found that really quite fascinating.
Yeah, well, I mean, very few people would be using a Bolex camera today, but it's the camera that their father would have used or something similar. Actually, there's a Russian camera that's mentioned in the film too, so he may have used that. But the Bolex, they're all sort of wind up, something that an amateur filmmaker would use. So I think that sort of ties Martin back to the past. I mean, what he's doing is something that the Leyland brothers would have done in the late 1970s, early 80s, I think, when that television show aired.
Mm.
For people who don't know, it was a sort of folksy travelogue kind of show put on by two brothers who I think lived in Newcastle, which was actually shot on Super 8, which was not known by Channel 9 at the time. And it might have been the only broadcast television show that was shot on Super 8. And I remember each episode began with an intro showing a 16mm camera to try and fool us and the station that it was all shot on 16mm, but no, it was Super 8. But anyway, we've passed that age of presenting these kind of documentaries like that. So Martin already is linked back to the past and kind of irrelevant. He may be trying to repeat what his father did all those years ago, or live up to perhaps the expectations of his father. So somehow he's trapped by the past as well.
Okay. Again, very very interesting to hear. I like the two actors, Philip McInnes and Petra Gleeson. Tell me about casting them and working with them.
Well, I'll start with Petra because I've been making films with Petra for 14 years, I think. Now that's behind the camera as well as in front of the camera. We've made 3 films where she's appeared as an actor, but 5 films where she's been behind the scenes as a co-producer. So initially, back in 2009, I advertised for someone to help me make a film. And I sort of said, the less I have to do, the better the film will be. So she came on board. I didn't ask for an actor, and I found out she was an actor. She didn't act in that film, but the next one she was cast in that film with Phil McInnes. So that was like 10 years prior to when we shot this film. That film was called The Outing. And so they appeared together back then. And then I had not seen Phil since 2012, say, when the film premiered. So it was a reunion of sorts. I mean, I did audition a few guys for that role, and we chose Phil, and so we were back together. So it was quite nice. 10 years later, and I felt, yeah, of all the guys that we auditioned, he would bring the richest interpretation of Martin, judging by what I knew of him in the past and by his very audition on that day. And so it was quite pleasant having the 3 of us together again.
Okay, very good, very good. And tell me about the location work, because there's some really interesting locations that you've used, and obviously areas that people wouldn't have looked at properly before or really investigated. Any challenges in filming in those locations?
Well, sometimes when you need to climb a mountain or a volcano and carry your gear up to the top, it can be exhausting and bringing it down again. So there was that, so that physical aspect to it. But once you're up there, it's just another set. We did drive up to Mount Elephant. There's an access road, and so we drove my four-wheel drive into the crater, because you're always trying to get the vehicle as close as possible to the site where you're setting up a camera. But other than that, they were quiet locations. There weren't many people around. So it was quite pleasant most of the time. The weather was kind to us. I had explored all these locations prior to this on trips that had nothing to do with film, it was just recreation. So I was familiar with most of them. There was one called Giant Rock that I had never been to, but I had read about it. So that was a new one for me. But the other volcanoes I had seen before and walked up to the top and was quite familiar. Of course, I had to then, before filming, revisit and decide where I was going to place the camera. So it's all quite physical, a lot of walking involved in just in preparing for the shoot. But they're always going to be there. You know, they've been there for so long, and they don't change. So they're reliable, they're accessible, and most of the time you can get a decent shot of them. But they're such large scale. Sometimes that's an issue too. So you need to figure out how you're going to sort of convey the scale of these massive structures on film. You're always trying to capture it into a little viewfinder. So yeah, that's a bit of a challenge. But no, it was quite pleasant out there in March, April. Which the weather's quite calm, and I try and shoot my films at that time of the year always, because you know, it's not as windy and stuff, and the weather's still pleasant. The days are still kind of longish, so you can get a bit done. And I just like shooting outdoors because it's like a vast empty theatre space that once you've got the actors, you can fill it. I mean, in the past I've shot in, you know, cramped rooms indoors in homes and stuff, and unless you've got the money to sort of for art direction, and which, you know, may help your story and say something about the characters, it becomes quite difficult. Whereas with the location, they're just waiting to be filmed, and if you can incorporate them into your story, as I think I've done quite well with this film, then they're a real asset. I mean, I often look at 1950s American westerns and how the terrain was captured in those days, and that's a bit of an inspiration too. Particularly films like the Bud Boetticher westerns, which were modestly budgeted, you know, still Hollywood films, but yeah, modestly budgeted and very contained, you know, very concentrated, terrific scripts, and no fat on them at all. And anyway, he had a great eye for the landscape and made terrific use out of it. So yeah, I think that definitely is a source of inspiration. Yeah.
Oh, how very interesting. And it's great to use Australian locations, Victorian locations, etc., which are underutilized. So that's terrific. Nice to see that in the film.
Yeah, well, I haven't seen those volcanic features in a feature film anyway, in a dramatic feature film. So maybe they were. I'm not aware of it though. And look, when we were there, we didn't see a lot of people there. So perhaps people need to explore, you know, that part of Victoria and have a look what's there. It's fascinating. Yeah.
It is, definitely. Now, as I mentioned, the film screening September 8th and 10th at the Nova Cinema. A few more questions I want to ask you, but how can people actually book to see the film?
Yeah, there's a website, trybooking, trybooking.com. You go on there and there's a menu in the top right-hand corner, and click on that, and there'll be a search field, and you type in My Friend the Moon as the event, and it should come up. And as we mentioned, it's a free event. There's 2 sessions, one on the Friday night, one on the Sunday afternoon. And there'll be a Q&A. With the second screen, with the Sunday, there'll be Jake Wilson, the Age film critic, conducting or moderating the Q&A for that one. And I'll be there, and Petra and Phil will be there. On the Friday night, I think it'll just be the 3 of us, not Jake, and we'll just chat with the audience and take questions and just have a discussion about, you know, this film and Australian filmmaking, and you know, we'll see where it goes.
It all sounds very good to me. So tell me, is My Friend the Moon later on going to get some other sort of release?
Well, not a commercial release, but my job is to try and enter as many festivals here and overseas as possible. They all charge fees, so you know, you can't continually enter festivals, but I'll carefully choose which ones I think are appropriate, and that's one way of seeing it in a festival setting. Who knows? I might put on another screening myself, or someone may approach me, but it was never meant to have a commercial release or anything like that, and I won't be making it available online. I don't like people seeing it online because I'm a true believer in seeing films in a cinema, and that's to do with levels of concentration. Look, a film, you know, it's been said that the best writers now are gravitating towards television and the longer episodic sort of television. That's a different sort of art form. I mean, the 2 hour or 1.5 hour feature film, it's compressed storytelling. Not only that, seen on a big screen, it's about the picture and the sound much more than something made for television. And something like My Friend the Moon, you really need to interpret what you're seeing beyond simply the story. There are things happening beneath the surface of the film. Even the very first shot, as with the opening credits, is symbolic. And this sort of symbols and metaphors happen throughout the film. So there's another layer to it. And seeing it in a cinema in a darkened room where you're not likely to get up and down and miss anything, that's the sort of viewer that I'm after. And so it should be a very sort of concentrated experience. And I think it's a film that is better on a second viewing. So if anyone wants to take advantage of that and come on Friday night, think about it a bit and come back on a Sunday afternoon, you might be able to pose even more interesting questions to me, having thought about it and seen it again. Because in retrospect, you begin to understand, you know, the early scenes and see into the depths of the film, I think. That's ideally how I'd like people to experience the film.
Fair comment, fair enough, and I certainly appreciate that. And yes, I could see while I was watching the film that it would have a valued second viewing to get some of the nuances that were established the first time I saw it. So yeah, sounds great. Okay, and just to ask you, Mark, are you working on another film at the moment?
Yes, I am. And again, it's set outdoors. It's about a woman who's searching for her uncle who believes that there's a creature, a sort of a humanoid creature living in the forest, and he's developed an obsession with this. And he's a man that doesn't cope well with the real world and often disappears into the forest. And on one occasion, she has caused him distress and he's disappeared yet again into the forest, and she goes to search for him. And if everything goes to plan, Petra will again play a major role as the niece. So I'm writing that. I've had to put it aside as I finished off this film and prepare for this screening. But I'm looking forward to getting back into it and getting into it again. Script writing, once you've got a script, I believe you're halfway there. So it's a very important document to have, and it's worth spending time with and getting it right before you get your camera out. So that's what I'll be doing most of next year, I think, just trying to complete the script.
Sounds good. And I assume it will be a digital camera you'll be using.
Yes, absolutely. Although I've got a fondness for analog, as you see in this My
Yeah.
Friend the Moon, and in Regolith, that was made before it entirely shot, as I said, on 16mm. Digital film is developing every year, and a company like Blackmagic Design has come up with cameras that are so reasonably priced and yet display a fantastic cinematic image. They're there for filmmakers like me to use, to exploit. And so definitely digital. I have no issue. I'm not like Tarantino. I don't have any hang-ups about using digital cameras. Who knows where they're going? I mean, at some stage they're going to surpass film in terms of dynamic range, and color. I don't think they're quite there with color, but they will be in the future. So yeah, definitely digital, and it's just so practical. I didn't mind shooting. I shot my short film Regolith myself, and I quite enjoyed it. And there's some joy in the sort of anticipation of waiting to see the rushes, and also the film is expensive, and so you need to be quite organised and know what you're doing. But I began decades ago making film on film in Super 8 and 16mm, and the economic sort of practices I developed then of not shooting too much, shooting a limited number of takes, it's kind of stayed with me. So I'm not undisciplined with digital. Every take has a purpose. And so I've retained that discipline.
Very, very interesting and very good to hear. We've been speaking to Mark La Rosa, who's the writer-director of My Friend the Moon, screening at the Nova Cinema on the 8th and the 10th of September, and they're free screenings. And Mark, thanks so much for talking with me.
Oh, it was a pleasure, Peter. Nice talking to you again.
All the best then. Okay. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.